So I want to share with our listeners, Moralong says cater deployment is exposed at the Life Isidimeni arbitration process. Mxolisi Dlamini, though, is very excited. You just made my morning. Iman Lord Hain has been a consistent supporter of our liberation pre and post apartheid. And that's who my next guest is for this hour. Lord Peter Hain is a former British MP, a leader of the anti-apartheid movement and the anti-Nazi League in Britain. It's my pleasure to have you on Power Talk this morning, Lord Hain. Thank you for your time.
It's a pleasure being with you, and I'm delighted. Thank you for asking me on.
And I'm glad you could make the time. We've got so much ground to cover, Lord Peter Hain, in the next hour, and I suspect the time is going to be eaten away greedily, and there will be interaction with some of our listeners. But perhaps for those who are not familiar with your work, I've shared with our listeners that you were a Labour MP between 1991 and 2015, a senior minister for 12 years in Tony Blair and Gordon Brown's governments. You served as Secretary of State for Wales and Northern Ireland League. Perhaps just map for us a little bit of your history by way of introduction in the anti-apartheid movement.
Well, my childhood was in South Africa, living in Pretoria. My parents, both South African born, were active in the anti-apartheid struggle. They were jailed. One of my earliest memories as an 11-year-old boy was my mother and father being told in the middle of the night they'd been put in jail for supporting Nelson Mandela's defiance campaign. And then my mother was issued with a banning order in 1963, prevented her from being involved in political activity. My father, in 1964, one of the clauses in a banning order, by the way, in those days, those dark apartheid days, was you could not communicate with another banned person. Mm-hmm. And they'd never banned a husband and wife before. Wow. So they had to give them special permission to talk to each other exceptionally, one other banned person, namely each other. And then they stopped my father working as an architect, and we had to leave the country in 1966. And then a few years later, I led campaigns to stop all-white Springbok and cricket tours by running on the pitch and laying siege to the teams in their hotels and so on.
This is your role as part of the Stop the 70 Tour Committee?
That's right, yes. And we used direct action to invade the pitches, chained ourselves to the goalposts in the case of rugby, and in the case of cricket, just physically stopped cricket matches. And the tours were then halted, and they never toured again until after the transformation, until after Nelson Mandela was elected president in 1994.
And people really took you and the movement seriously, because we were told that virtually every match afterwards was played in an atmosphere of siege. There were large deployments of police personnel to protect grounds. There were rows of policemen encircling the playing fields. Barbed wire fences even erected inside and outside the grounds. Police dogs brought in. So it certainly was able to create a moment of awareness, conscience, and certainly spurred the paranoia of our government at that time.
Yes, it did, and it was a very difficult time for the anti-apartheid struggle. The ANC's leadership was in prison on Robben Island and elsewhere. There was massive torture and repression. It was a very difficult time for the anti-apartheid struggle, and internal resistance had virtually been closed down. And that is why the international struggle at that stage in the late 60s, early 70s was so crucial. And because we actually won the sports apartheid battle, because we stopped all white sports teams touring abroad, that was a very big blow to white South Africans who backed apartheid and were part of it, and who craved international sport and its recognition and accolades that came with it. So it was a decisive victory, and that then obviously happened at a time before the Soweto uprising in 1976, then before the resistance really took off inside the country in the 1980s, and the transformation then happened. So it was a very important time when internal resistance had been all but closed down.
Over nearly 50 years, Lord Peter Hain has been in politics. He's written or edited 21 books, including the biography of Mandela in 2010. You spoke to us just now, Lord Peter Hain, about the kind of political persecution that your parents had experienced, but this didn't inoculate you from your own persecution, and understandably so, by the government of that time. You were yourself a target of a failed letter bomb attack in the early 70s.
Yes, I was. In June 1972, we opened a package in our family house in southwest London, and there was a letter bomb of the kind that had killed very important anti-apartheid activists like Ruth First, who was assassinated in Maputo with a similar bomb, and others across the world. And fortunately, there was a timing mechanism problem and fault in mine, or I would have been blown up together with my family and our entire house. The security police in London told us when they came to make the bomb safe. And then other things happened. I was put on trial for conspiracy to stop all white South African tours in the Old Bailey in London for a month. That was South African financed conspiracy trial. It was a private prosecution, but I knew nothing about.
Unfortunately, you were acquitted, right?
I was acquitted, and it turned out subsequently that it was confirmed it had been a South African agent who looked very like me, who'd committed the theft, left his fingerprint on the bank notes that were thrown back to the chasing bank staff, the pursuers. But anyway, I was eventually acquitted. So, yeah, I had my fair amount of aggravation, but nothing to compare with what was suffered by those inside the country who were put in prison for life, like Mandela and Sisulu and Kathrada and many others, or those who just disappeared or were tortured or killed in other ways.
Is that what spurred you on to continue, despite a very real threat against yourself as well?
Yes, I didn't believe that any threats. I've never believed that threats should deter me from doing what was right. I was inspired by my parents, who were very brave, very unusual young white South Africans. They didn't need to give up what was a very privileged life in Pretoria in those days, and they sacrificed everything. We left penniless. The only thing we had was a job awaiting my dad in London, and we stayed with the family. So they sacrificed a lot, and they've always been towering inspiration to me. My father sadly died in October, and my mother's now quite frail in age 90, but they've done made an enormous contribution.
You talk about not being cowed by threats. You are very familiar with South African politics, and one of the politicians we've been talking about this morning was the former ANC MP Makhosi Khoza and her consistent railing against the state of affairs inside the party and why she has withdrawn from the party and resigned her positions. You have a view on her travails?
Well, she's a very brave woman. I still hope, as a long-standing ANC supporter, that there will be big change at the conference in December and a new leadership, because the country desperately needs that. The ANC needs that. And she was demanding that as well and took a very firm, principled stand. Obviously, for me, I'm no longer a South African in that sense. That was taken away from me by the apartheid government. And I've lived 50 years of my life in Britain. But I'm still still care a lot about the country, and the leadership has to change, or the country will go down the drain. The corruption and the cronyism, the intimidation that she suffered from, that has no place in the vision that Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu and Ahmed Kathrada and Dennis Goldberg and all of those veterans of the anti-apartheid struggle, and the great constitutional, democratic, moral tradition of the ANC, that's got to be reclaimed by the ANC, or it will die, and the country will continue to suffer. So I strongly sympathise with her.
And you do have strong views on our current economic fortunes. You have spoken extensively about that. You used the word cronyism just now. And you've been quoted as saying, "It seems to me that with cronyism replacing merit, the state, including parastatals, is becoming increasingly dysfunctional. This is lethal for economic prosperity." Given that these are some of the diagnosis of our illness in our economy right now, where do our real prospects lie from your vantage point of how we can make meaningful transformation in our economy?
Well, I'm out here, as I have been a number of times over the past year since I was appointed visiting professor at Wits Business School. I'm out here teaching students at the business school, and they're some of the most the brightest, most dynamic young South African leaders, if you like, in this case mostly in the business community, though in other organizations as well. And there's so much talent in this country, so much potential economically in terms of resources, in terms of the country as a whole, that to waiting to be unleashed, that's got to be allowed to happen, and government should be enabling that to happen, not stopping it, and not siphoning off the money into private pockets of the politicians and their cronies in certain businesses and so on. So, what I'm hopeful is that the younger generation in South Africa, such as the students that I'm teaching and very much enjoying Wits Business School, that they are the ones who will insist to win a landslide over the Labour, led by Jeremy Corbyn. And young people turned out in a way they'd never turned out for generations, and they stopped that happening. If the young generation in South Africa today actually voted, registered to vote, and voted, remember 40% of the population was born free since apartheid ended, and it's an increasingly young electorate over the years, then you can change things, and that has to happen.
You were speaking at a panel discussion entitled South Africa Hero to Zero. It was held in the city yesterday, focusing on the role of business in South Africa's political climate. And
it's for Henley Business School,
Yeah, one of the kinks in our carpet that we keep tripping over, Lord Peter Hain, is the fact that, there's an argument that we gave away too much at the point of negotiation, particularly the keys to our economy. And you have some particularly strong views on this, talking about under-apartheid government and big businesses run exclusively by the white minority. When white rule finally comes to an end, the fear was that white business and investors would flee. So a deal was struck, compromises were made for the sake of a peaceful and economically stable transition. For those who have a very strong critique of what they say are the concessions made by the team led by Mandela, how do you counter some of their fears and concerns that perhaps we gave away too much?
Well, I don't know. I don't really think that the transformation could have happened stably and peacefully in any other way. The problem was afterwards. You had to get an orderly transfer when an elite, in this case a white apartheid elite running the economy as well, to get them to give up power, it has to be done in a negotiated way, and that is what Nelson Mandela, supported by Cyril Ramaphosa and Thabo Mbeki and others, managed to achieve. And it was an incredible transformation, very different from other countries, so bitterly divided, where the transformation has been violent and the aftermath has been very, very bad for the country and the people. So I don't criticize that at all. What I do criticize, particularly in recent years, is the way in which not just through corruption and cronyism, but there hasn't been a spreading of wealth and of opportunity in the way that there shouldn't have been, that there should have been. Now, of course, change takes time. I've been in politics now for 50 years, as you said earlier, and it takes time. I was very impatient as a young activist, stopping South African cricket and rugby tours and so on. I wanted change right away. I wanted apartheid to end then. It doesn't happen like that. So I think what you have to do is accept that the transformation happened in the way that it did. No good going back and saying Mandela betrayed us and all of that nonsense. He didn't. On the very contrary, we would not have been as stable and as peaceful a society and relatively successful since his leadership had he not been there with his comrades. But much more should have been done to transform the economy in favor of the majority. And actually then you've had, since President Zuma took over, something else on a quite a different plane entirely, which is the corruption and the cronyism. And now that is like a cancer through the state system. And what worries me is not just the robbery of millions and billions of rand from taxpayers and ordinary citizens. Not just that, that's bad enough. It's placing people in positions who happen to be your friends when they're incompetent at doing the job. And when that happens, the state starts to be dysfunctional. Now we're talking about the water system maybe not being as efficient as it was because it's not properly managed and it hasn't been invested in, just like South African Airways, which is used to be one of the top airlines in the world. Now it's a basket case with massive debts. If the water system isn't run properly, it's been one of the best water systems in the world, not just in Africa, but the entire world. That's very dangerous. Once you allow cronyism and your friends to take over from competence and efficient individuals, that's very, very dangerous. And so I think that is the problem now, not just the need to spread wealth and power.
So where are the control? Who holds the control levers then, Lord Peter Hain, in a context like this, where you say that via the ballot, is it through protest, is it through a party finding and leadership finding its conscience? Where for you are the opportunities to dial this back?
Well, the ANC, the party I've supported for many years, has been the ruling party since 1994. It must take, and its leaders must take full responsibility for what's happened. And that has to change, and those leaders have to change, and not just at a national level, but at a provincial and municipal level and city level as well. And we saw the results of the elections last year, which were a big blow to the ANC, and that was the people saying, "Look, we're not prepared to see this continue anymore." And so that's at one level. That is the decisive level that has to be changed, and it has to be changed from within the ANC and from popular pressure outside. Or the ANC will die and it will not win future elections. That is a life or death choice for it, but it's a life or death choice for the country. Why I'm nevertheless optimistic, and I spoke about this at Henley Business School yesterday morning, is because there are a number of forces within South Africa which are not present. We're not present, for example, in Zimbabwe, which is, has been so badly damaged under President Mugabe. You have a very independent opposition, vigorously independent. That's important to any democracy. You have a vigorously independent media, with newspapers like Business Day and City Press and the Mail and Guardian, speaking out strongly and exposing things. And Daily Maverick online and Biz News online, they're very important. You didn't have those in Zimbabwe. You have a very independent civil society making its voice heard just about every day. The trade union movement also asserting itself. You also have the finest constitution in the world, an independent judiciary. So there are a lot of things, and you have a system of financial regulation and business law and governance, which is also internationally respected. So you have a lot of things which are positive, and what that has to be built upon to overcome this tidal wave of corruption and cronyism.
You speak about the vanguard of our democracy being all of these different instruments, ending by talking about financial regulation and so on. And yet, in some ways, it has not insulated us from, the malfeasance and malpractice by some of these organizations, multinational companies that exist in South Africa. You would have, paid attention to KPMG and their travails in our country.
Absolutely.
Parliament is saying perhaps some of their recommendations, their reports and findings have to be questioned going back as far as 10 years. We've had, of course, the very insidious interference of PR agencies, international PR agencies like Bell Pottinger. We've got McKinsey. There's a whole maelstrom of organizations that were once seen to be above the parapet who have been caught up in or tainted with the brush of corruption. On the one hand, yes, we've got the systems like the IRBA, and we've got SAICA, the Chartered Accountants Association, who must look into this, must ascribe culpability and liability. But the fact is, it did happen.
Yes, it did. And I have led the charge in Britain and in the British Parliament against Bell Pottinger and also criticizing KPMG, because it is completely unacceptable for British corporates, which is the case of Bell Pottinger and KPMG, to be feeding at the trough of corruption and cronyism, and that is what they were doing. Bell Pottinger, of course, suffered badly and went out of business, went bankrupt, and quite rightly too. And KPMG has sacked its entire South African leadership and is being badly damaged reputationally in other ways, not just in South Africa, where it's been losing contracts as a result, but also across the world, globally damaged. It's a global company. And the same will happen to McKinsey's and any other corporate international company that is also feeding at this trough of corruption. And I think it's a salutary warning to every company in South Africa, foreign-based or not, because there are some South African counted. We live in such a transparent world where whistleblowing and social media and brave journalism will expose you, and you will suffer. Your bottom line will suffer, and you will suffer as a business unless you have nothing to do with that. And that is true for banks as well. We've seen a number of banks refusing to provide accounts anymore for the Gupta empire. And we will see a lot of this. And I think business needs to take a lead and step up to the plate instead of just saying, we're not political. Well, of course, they're not party political, but this has now come to the point where it is an economic choice and a business choice, as well as a civil society choice and a political choice for the country and for every citizen.
Lord Peter Hain is my guest. We'll continue to talk to him straight after this. It's time for Power News Headlines and Traffic, 10:30 exactly. Power News Headlines.